In between my bigger builds, I often like to make signs. They're kind of a fun project that you can do a little more quickly. In fact, I've actually already made 2 videos of making signs. One of them is for the intro video to my channel where I make this sign behind me. The other one is a more complicated sign that I make for a friend. I'll post links to those videos at the end of this video and in the video description below. Today I'd like to focus a little bit more specifically on signs that you can make if you have a laser cutter. These are some examples of ones that I've done already. We'll talk about them a little bit, but I think more interestingly, we'll make 2 new signs using techniques I haven't used before. And along the way, I'll share with you some of the tips and tricks that I have learned in helping me to make some of these signs. My first tip is an important one, and that is that you need to know your materials. You can't just choose your materials based on how you want the sign to look at the end, though that is important. You also need to know the characteristics of working with them, what they can and cannot do. And so for this sign, which is probably the easiest of the signs I have up here, there's a lot more choices that you can have in working with the material. The laser did almost all of the work on this particular sign. For that material, I used this. This is a 1/8 or 3mm thick piece of plywood. It's got a maple veneer on both sides, and running down the middle is an MDF core. One thing to know about the limitations of this material is that it is very prone to bending and warping. So in almost all cases, I will take a thicker sheet of plywood once I'm done doing the engraving on the laser, and I will glue the 2 together. That provides an end that's a little bit inconsistent, and so often you have to put in a border. I'll be making a border in one of the signs I make today, so you'll get to see a little bit about how that's done later. Now, at first glance, this particular sign may look a lot like that sign in terms of the material that I'm using, but that's not the case. They are both a maple on the outside, but instead of using the MDF core plywood, on this sign I'm using a solid piece of maple. The maple usually comes in something a bit thicker, so I have to resaw it down, and I'll show you that process in a little bit. The technique that I use on the laser is the same. I engraved the image, and in this case I cut out the letters. But the look is different. This one was brown from the engraving, and this one you can see is darker. And that's because I took a black epoxy and I filled in the holes of the letters I cut out, and I even filled in the top of the engraving that I cut. Once I did that, I had to sand it down, and that's why I used the solid piece of maple. Had I used the veneer instead, I would have sanded through the top layer of the veneer in some places, and you would have seen the MDF that was beneath it. We don't want that. I do use the same technique to make it stable. I glued the 1/4-inch piece that's been cut on the laser to a piece of plywood to get the final result. And that leads me to my second tip. If you don't want to have a border like I had on the Yoda, you can still make it look like it's a single piece of wood. And the way that I do that is with edge banding. Edge banding is simply applied by cutting out the right length, putting a little bit of an overlap on the top and the bottom, and using a hot iron to stick them 2 together. That overlap can be trimmed off with a special trim razor, just made for edge banding. But if you don't have that, you can still do it with a simple utility knife. This third sign is obviously a different material, and I have a few tips for you when working with acrylic plastic like this. The laser cutter cuts it just fine. One trick is to know how to put the 2 pieces together if you want to do a layered look like this. For this, I use this weld-on cement. You have to be careful with this stuff. It evaporates really quickly. I keep it in this can, and then when I use it, I use an applicator with a thin needle at the end to actually apply it. The other thing that I do when I work with layers like this is that when I cut out the outline here, I also do a scoring just a little bit inset for where the things that will go on top of it are going to be placed. That allows me to line things up properly, and it tells me where the glue should go. In one of the signs we're making later today, I'll show you a little bit more about how that's done. Another tip is that when working with plastic like this, it helps to work with the final color, but you don't have to. In this case, only this black background and this particular E are the color that came from the cast acrylic itself. For the other letters, I just used a spray paint. And really, in the end, you can't tell the difference unless you were to run your finger over them, and you can get a little bit of a difference in the texture. Well, we're off to a good start. The tips and tricks that I've shared with you already are things that I think you could use right away to make some signs of your own. You can probably also apply these tips to other crafts that you make with your laser cutter. I'll share with you one last one before we move along, and that's how I attach these to the wall. I just use command strips. You can buy them at any grocery store, box store, or craft store, and they hold up signs of this side with no problem at all. To go a little bit deeper, I think the next thing we should do is start making some signs of our own. I'm going to make 2 more signs in this particular video, and along the way I'm going to push myself by using some new materials that I haven't used before and some new techniques. I'll share with you what I learned along the way, and I'll share with you some lessons that I've learned from previous builds. The first one that I'm going to make is going to be a depth map. You'll see how that works with several layers. It's going to be a map of the Puget Sound area, which is where I grew up. I'm looking forward to building it. Let's get started. Quickly though, before we get to the build, I realized I can show you how to hang a heavier sign when command strips aren't going to be strong enough. So here's a tip for doing that. I use what are called French cleats, and that's simply a board with a 45-degree angle cut on it, both on the sign backing and on the wall itself. They face in opposite directions, and when they're hung, gravity simply pulls them into place and pulls the sign right up against the wall. You can even adjust them if you just attach it with the screw, put it on, check for level, go back and adjust it. All right, now we can get to those new signs. Well, I hope you'll excuse the mess, but this work starts on the computer, and I'll show you what I'm going to do in just a second. But I want to start with one little tip. I actually tried to make this file myself to do all these different layers using some maps that I found from images online. After a while, I realized just how hard that was, and so I went over to Etsy and I wanted to see if someone else had done it for me, and it turns out they had. So one of those tips that doesn't really involve a laser is that sometimes it's not a bad idea to just use the work of others. On this particular sign there are 10 different depths, and each depth came with 2 vector files. The white portion of the vector file is the portion that needs to be cut out. For the bottom several layers, the area that was covered by the cut was actually quite small, so I decided to use a smaller area for what I was going to cut out in order to be a little bit more efficient on the materials. Now, as I mentioned, I've never done this particular thing before, so I don't know if this is the right way, but it is the way that I did it. And the way that I did it was to create my own vector files for each one of the layers. For the lower depths, I start with a rectangle the size that I want to cut out. I then use the exclusion function on the path in order to get the shape in its inverted form. I will repeat this process on the next higher layer in order to get the cutout shape there. I'll copy that cutout shape, bring it over and paste it in place on the lower layer. I then put back the rectangle for the cutout outline, and I got rid of the larger rectangle. If there was an engraving, for instance for the depth mark on that depth, I grabbed that from the other file and I also pasted it in place. I repeated this process on each one of the layers, and that gave me a file that had the cutout, the score for the layer above it so I could see where to put it, and any sort of text engraving that I needed. With the files all complete, the next step is to prepare the material. And I do this by putting this masking tape over the length of the material to protect it from the burn marks that come both from engraving and from cutting. If you're interested in this material, I'll provide a link to it in the video description below. I then smooth it out with the card scraper and it's ready to go. Here's a tip, especially if you're someone who uses your laser cutter a lot. When I originally got this unit, I also got this filter that came with it, and I would vent directly into that filter. There are a couple problems with this. One is that it didn't completely get rid of the smell that kind of gets associated with either the burning wood or the melting plastic that you're cutting inside of here, and it was very noisy. So I very soon upgraded to this system over here. I simply bought a fan. I bought one that is known for not being too noisy, but is able to get the right amount of flow through it, and I directly vent it straight out the wall to the outside. Now they do make options so that you can vent it through a window if that's what you would prefer. You simply grab the kind of venting that you would use in a portable air conditioner. Definitely a recommendation from me. If you're going to be doing a lot of cutting, find a way to upgrade your system and get it out of your house. As the laser does the work for me here, you can see how that space savings works out. The laser is currently cutting the lowermost depth that actually spans the whole area of the sign. On the right, those 3 rectangles there are 3 of the lower depths where it uses a much smaller portion, and I'm able to get 4 different layers out of this one sheet. These 3 smaller ones will stack up behind that upper left-hand corner you just saw. The last piece is cutting out right now on the laser. I'd say each one of these layers here took about 10 minutes to cut, but that last one's a little over 2 hours with all the detail that's going to go into it. I thought I'd give you one lesson learned and also talk about one tip before we get started. The lesson learned is there's about 10 layers here, and I'm working with a 1/8 inch material. So we're looking at, with all of those layers, we're getting close to 1.5 inches in thickness on this sign. Probably should have gone down to 2 millimeters, but this is what I had on hand. The tip that I wanted to bring up is something that a lot of people don't know, but a good way to stain wood in a color is to use acrylic paint. Typically what I do is I take some acrylic paint and I stick it into a little cup like this, and I add some water. I usually use about 1 part paint to 4 parts water. If I want it to look a little lighter, I just add a little more water, mix it in, and then paint it on and let it dry. I'm going to be doing these layers where it starts dark and it gets lighter as it goes up. First I'll start with the paint, and I'll just add some more water to it to lighten it up. As I get up a little higher, I'll mix the blue with some white. I start with the deepest layer, which will also have the darkest paint. And you really do have to mix that water in really well in order to spread the paint around. To the right of the screen you can see the layers that I've done, and you can see that the paint is gradually getting a little bit lighter. This is my first full sheet here, and the score lines that I provided for gluing the top piece down also give me an area within which I need to paint. Moving up a layer, I add a little bit of white to the mixture to lighten it up just a little bit. Even doing this, the color variations were fairly subtle, and I think you probably could have done even better if you'd given yourself a little bit of a palette and compared all of the colors for each of the layers before the painting was started. Still, I'm happy with the way that it turned out, and once I got the paint on all the layers, I could turn my attention to gluing them together. In the beginning, my glue up process worked by putting the glue onto the bottom layer and trying to keep that glue outside of the scored line for the layer above. I realized though that it would actually be easier to put the glue on the bottom of the top layer, since that cutout was already done, and just smooth it out over that and place the 2 layers together. A few of the layers, especially the top layer, had little islands that needed to be put in. And when I took that out of the laser cutter, I needed to preserve where those islands would go, so I used that blue tape to hold them in place. It was then something of a game akin to Operation, where I could take out the particular tiny islands, put a little bit of CA glue on them, and just attach them one by one till I had them all in place. With all the islands attached with CA glue, I switched back over to the wood glue, spread it around on the topmost layer, and then fitted it in, making sure that I had the right spacing both on all the edges and against all of the islands. Well, it's all glued together, and I'll actually show you the back first. There's that section that goes to the deepest part of the ocean, and it sticks out quite a bit, as you can see. Because of that, I'm going to have to come up with a frame that frames that same distance in depth all the way around. It will give it a nice place to hang from the top, but it's a little bit of extra work. Here it is in the front. One lesson I learned in doing the painting, I wasn't counting on the paint dripping down quite so much, and so you kind of have this inconsistent dark carbon look with the blue. I'll go back and repaint that. I also somehow lost Bainbridge Island. I'll have to go cut a new one of that. Sorry if anybody from Bainbridge Island is watching. The way I'm going to make the frame is I'm going to have a nice thick frame here that has a lip that sticks up 1/4 of an inch and a lip that sticks into the frame about 1/4 of an inch as well to cover this part here. In order to do that, because it's such a big piece that I'm going to have to do, I'm going to take it out of this piece of 6'4" or 1.5" rough cut maple. And the way that I'm going to do that is actually to dado out a little U shape here, which will be the left and right side of a particular piece of frame. By having the lip on both sides, it'll make the dado cut a little bit safer. But first I have to clean that up a little bit, and to do that, I'll get started and let future voiceover me do the rest of the explaining. I need to clean up and square 3 sides in order to get this work done, and the first 2 I can do on this jointer. I start with one of the wide surfaces, and once that is cleaned up, I can take that surface and put it against my 90-degree fence in order to do one of the narrower surfaces. The third surface is then done on a thickness planer. The U-shaped dado is done using a dado blade, and I just give it a 1/4 inch away from the fence on the first pass and keep going through until I've taken out enough material. The U cutout provides 2 frame pieces, so the first rip I have to do is to get that 1/4 inch lip on the other side. Then I can cut the 2 pieces down to their appropriate width. You can see here how those lips are going to work on the frame itself and how they're going to cover up all those layers. I miter the ends using my compound miter saw at 45-degree angles. With one side cut, I can compare it against the sign itself and mark where the next cut needs to happen. My first pass at the opposite end miter is a little bit wide so that I can actually compare it against the sign and make adjustments as needed. I use a band clamp to hold the whole thing together while it's being glued up, and insert the sign itself in order to make sure that everything is nice and square. A few gentle taps of a mallet will always take care of any little offsets that you need to fix. Another tip. You know how they sometimes say you can never have too many clamps? Lies. In fact, you probably have too many clamps. You should take a look at all the clamps that you have, figure out which ones are excess for you, send them to me. I'll take care of them for you. One more tip. When you're doing these frames, in this particular one for instance, 3 of the corners came out really well, but there is a little bit of a gap on this particular one. It's just a hair, but it does need fixing. A good way to do that is to take some glue, put it inside that little hairline crack there, and then take your sander and just go right over it while the glue's still wet. This puts the sawdust into that glue line, and it makes it so that the seam isn't visible anymore. The sign is now all sanded nice and smooth and it's ready for its finish. But I'm going to wait till the very end to put the finish on. That way I can do both signs together. And speaking of that next sign, that's what we're going to work on next. I'm going to be making that out of a different material. In this case, it's going to be this piece of walnut. Now I buy my walnut rough cut and at a 4/4 thickness. That means it's 1 inch thick to begin with. I used this piece on another project, so I've already smoothed out this side, and this side here. However, the laser cutter cannot get through something this thick. I'm going to have to bring it down to a 1/4 inch thickness, and I'm going to do that by resawing it on the bandsaw. So let's go over to the bandsaw and I'll talk about that process. One thing I didn't mention is that this process is actually kind of involved and it requires quite a few tools. So it may be possible to buy solid wood in 1/4 inch thicknesses. I've never really done that. It's more cost efficient to buy the larger wood and to work it, and I have the tools to do that. Also, I have shown in my videos a few times now the process of resawing, but I don't think I've ever actually talked through what's involved in it. Since this is a tips and tricks video, I think it's probably a good time to do that. The first thing, if you have a bandsaw, is setting it up properly, and that means having the right blade in it. Now this is a 5/8 inch blade. It's probably on the smallest end of what you'd want to do for resawing solid wood. You can go up to 1 inch. On top of that, you need to make sure it's calibrated properly. There's settings on most bandsaws to do that so that it won't wander as you're cutting through it. If it were to wander too much, you'd get one side or maybe even both of the boards that you're cutting out to be too thin for the application that you need. The next is this right here, this guard. It goes up and down, and I set it so it's about 1/2 inch above the highest point on the board that I'm cutting. And there are ways to do it with jigs, but I find that the best way to do it is actually to just run it right up against the fence, with the fence having been set to the proper depth, just using a tape measure. The one last thing that I'll say is when you watch this in videos, you're probably watching people who have sped it up 4 times or maybe even 8 times just to make the video go by faster. So don't judge the speed that you cut based on the videos that you've seen. Slow and steady is the way to do it on these. It keeps anything from wandering or binding up on you. Just to illustrate that point, as I am resawing this board, you're watching me play it back at 8 times speed. With the resaw all done, it's now time to glue it up. And there are some tips and tricks involved with that as well. The first is that a bookend look usually is the best look to go for. And so what you want to do is actually fold it out like you're reading a book. It is important, remember, that we only had one of these edges here that was smooth. So that edge needs to be the edge that you're gluing together. The other important thing is to keep the flat edge that we have on both sides and face those down towards the clamp. We'll push those up down against the clamp in order to get as flat a glue up as we can. It's also important that we do the thicknessing of it on the thicknessing planer after we do the glue up. So let's get started with that glue up. It's a pretty simple process. Add the glue, clamp it together, give it a little time. To show you quickly how I made the vector images for this Tron sign, I first went to a font generation tool on the web to get this text at the bottom. I brought those words over as an image, then used Inkscape's trace image feature to turn it into a vector. Trace image is a great feature, but sometimes you need to clean it up. So in particular, when I'm working with circles, ovals, or rectangles, I'll go in and put those shapes in myself. Here's one more trick that I use when I'm doing the laser. The first time that I cut a material, I actually create something about 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches on a square, and then I just simply put a bunch of lines there. I mark the name of the material and its thickness, and then I mark down the speed at which I'm running the laser through those lines. Once I cut those lines, I can look at the other side to see whether the laser cut got all the way through, how cleanly it got through, things like that. And then I just have a reference that I can look at anytime I cut that material again to know what speed setting I used. Well, now that you've seen the cutout for the sign, let me explain to you a little bit about the plan. This is the first sign that I'm going to build where I want it to be a backlit thing. In order to do that, I'm going to use this piece of plastic. It's clear, but it's actually designed for backlighting, so it has a little bit of a frosted surface to it. I'm going to use the epoxy to glue that to the back of the sign that I just cut. Once I give that some time, overnight probably, to set up, I'm going to come back and make some more epoxy, and this time add some color to it, and I will pour that color into the portions here that have been cut out. Let me give you one tip before I do that. If you're going to do something like this, you need to keep grain in mind. You see these circles, both for the O and for the light cycle wheels? If I were to move these from one circle to the other, it would be a mismatch with the cathedral pattern that's inside of there. Likewise, if I were to twist it at a 90-degree angle, all of a sudden I've got grain running vertically when it should be running horizontally. So don't just think of the geometry of these things. Think about how it looks with the pattern of the wood. That's why you're doing a wooden sign, is because you get that cool natural variation. But it's nice to get it nice and lined up too. All right, let's switch over to time-lapse me to get this job done. You might have noticed that while I'm doing this, I only took the plastic backing off on the side that I'm gluing. I leave the plastic on the other side because the static clean can pick up the dust from the shop. The epoxy is now cured overnight and everything is set up ready to fill it in. I don't know that I got this on video, but I actually had used some blue tape over the top of these inside pieces here to keep them from floating around while the epoxy was still super wet. There's a couple of things to know when using epoxy. The first is when you mix it together, try using a clear cup. That allows you to see almost exactly what the color is going to turn out to be. The other is that you should stir it slowly. A lot of the videos that are out there do large pours of epoxy and they'll use a drill to stir it all up. Don't do that for this type of application. You want to keep the bubbles down as much as possible. So stir in one direction, stir slowly, and be sure to scrape the sides of the cup as you go. The last little tip that I have is keep one of these kitchen torches around. The bubbles that come up to the top, if you hit it really quickly with a bit of flame, it'll pop those and they'll settle back down. If there's bubbles down below, you can take a little stick, kind of poke them and bring them to the top, and then hit it with this. The first epoxy color is kind of a translucent blue, so when it's lit up from behind, it'll look a lot like the title screen on the Tron movies. I had a little of this blue left over when I was done, and I added some clear and then put in some mica powder of a lighter blue and swirled those around together, adding a little bit of glitter to that. The final layer is a green that I started over with, and also is that translucent epoxy. My wish list for big power tools includes getting a new belt sander. In the meantime, I have to sand this all down by hand to get it to the level of the wood. Well, it's not normally that messy. It wasn't until a little ways into it that I realized I didn't have the vacuum plugged into the sander. And it turns out, actually, the sanding goes a lot faster when you're sucking up the dust and getting it out of the way of the grit. This has now been sanded up to 180 grit. Before I put a finish on it, I'll get it up to 500. Along the edges, there are some little white dots. And what those are bubbles that formed from air escaping from the pockets inside of the cells of the wood. So here's the tip to fix that. Just take a little pair of tweezers and get that dust out of there to begin with. Mix yourself up just a little tiny bit of epoxy and just put a little drop on each one of those holes. It can be clear, you don't have to match the color at all. It'll pick up the color underneath it. The frame for this is done in another piece of walnut. It's assembled similarly to the previous frame, but it looks quite a bit different. In this case, rather than having a lip that goes over the sign itself insets into some rabbets that I've cut into the frame. And I've actually cut these rabbets on both sides of the frame so that I can do the same thing with the backer board. I'm using two different finishes on the signs. The Puget Sound Depth Map sign is getting a water-based polyurethane coat, while the Tron sign is getting an oil-based finish, a hard wax oil. I'm using a battery-powered and remote-controlled LED light strip here, and I thought I'd test it out before assembling it. I also finally have to take off that paper backing on the optics plastic so that I can test these lights out on the sign itself. The lights do look a little bit better in person than they do on the camera, but I think it's still pretty awesome. To attach the backing, I countersink some holes and I simply screw it into place. The builds are all done, and I had fun making them. In addition to that, these were just great builds because of the tie they have back to the memories that I have from my childhood. I learned a few new things along the way as well, and I hope with some of the tips that I provided today that perhaps you learned some things too. And whether you're an aficionado for laser cutting, whether you're a woodworker, or whether you just like watching things get built, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please take a moment, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me get this content out to more people. Thank you for coming along on this journey with me. I'll see you at the next build where we get to do it again.